Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Whip Union, and in this one, we have several developments across the front line. In the south, in the direction of Robotyne, there has been a small advance by the Russians as they continue pushing through Ukrainian defensive positions here to the east of Novodanilivka and north of Verbove. Following the recapture of the fortified positions by Robotyne and Verbove, the main fighting is taking place along the final lines of defense that the Russians have yet to capture near Robotyne, but it's also expanded to the east of Novodanilivka, where the Russians are slowly pushing through along the highway between Novodanilivka to the east. In the direction of Krasnoyarivka, the Russians are advancing and pressing on the Ukrainian positions in the northwestern outskirts of the city, where they're now trying to gain control over the exit from the city area, and the Ukrainians are in the midst of a withdrawal out of the city area. So there is currently a race between the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, whether the Russians are able to encircle the Ukrainian soldiers in the northwestern parts of Krasnoyarivka, or the Ukrainians will manage to get out before the Russians capture it. So we see heavy fighting taking place as the Ukrainians are doing a fighting retreat out of the city, and the Russians are trying to catch up and gain full control over the city and attempt to encircle some Ukrainian soldiers. Talking about Ukrainian soldiers being encircled, we have reports here in the direction of Losovatske Progress area. According to Deep State map, the Russians have not fully captured this, but they have encircled Ukrainian soldiers in the fortified areas here south of Losovatske. However, according to Syriac maps, it has all been captured by the Russians, and therefore there's no encirclement, it's simply the Russians capturing the area. Whether one or the other is true, we're not really sure. It could be either, could be both, that the Russians encircled them and then has captured them, but we did not get the full details of the developments. There's also a delay on the updates of the Deep State map, which could mean that this has already been finished, but they're just now reporting on the situation now after it has finished. Here in the Donetsk front, Clement Molin, who has made the fortified map that I'm using to improve my analysis by adding all of the fortified positions across the map, has recently updated it. This is why we see a significant amount more of Ukrainian fortified positions in the section of the front line. So make sure to check out his Twitter and generally all of his information so that you can support him as well for all of the great work he has done, mapping out all of the fortified positions. In the direction of Vovche, the Russians have managed to capture the entire village and the fortified position right next to it. The Russians have broken through the Ukrainian defenses here by capturing Vovche and cutting the Ukrainians out of the crossing over the river line. This leaves the Ukrainians east of the river line completely cut off from supplies or any positions. The Ukrainians do still have fortified positions on the riverbank itself, which could cover a Ukrainian crossing across the river line. This means that they are not completely encircled, but the Russians are pushing on those fortified positions to try and capture it. But the Ukrainians do have their fortified position west of it that allows the Ukrainians to clash with the Russians during their attempts to cut off the Ukrainians in the eastern parts. So we see heavy fighting back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians here in the eastern parts, but following the capture of Vovche, the Russian positions here have improved significantly. To the northwest of Vovche, the Russians are moving on to the village of Vesele to the west and the village of Ivanivka to the north, as they push onwards towards the Ukrainian fortified positions east and south of those villages. The Ukrainians still have a series of fortified positions here in the area, which means it will be difficult to expect any Russian breakthrough further other than the 2-kilometer advance southwest of Progress along the railways and the captured fortified positions and the village of Vovche. But we will likely see the Russians' attempts to continue their current momentum, where they have recently, through the past few days, moved on to capture Progress, the fortified positions north of it, Losovatske, and moving onwards in these different directions. The Russians have been moving both north, west, and south as they have been pushing along the entirety of the Avdiivka section of the front line, and the current offensive operations are very intense. The Russians are pushing both here by Vovche, capturing the village and the fortified positions in the area, pushing onwards to the next fortified positions, but they're also pushing here along the southwest of Losovatske, capturing the fortified position of the Ukrainians there, and cutting off and encircling Ukrainian soldiers further east. To the north, the Russians are pushing towards Timofivka, where we've also seen that the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the fortified positions south of the village. So we see that the Russians are pushing across the entirety of the front line and are hitting Ukrainian positions everywhere, really. The Ukrainians with the 47th Mechanized Brigade are attempting to counterattack to regain some positions, but so far are failing to do so. They've been unable to recapture positions and instead are constantly being pushed back to further behind fortified positions, where they're forced to hold on to those positions and try to hold back the Russians and then reattempt some counterattacks, but so far they have been unable to recapture positions. We have had multiple videos of Ukrainian tanks in the area being hit by Russian FPV drones and artillery, while at the same time the Russians are advancing near the front. According to Deep State Map, what has caused the Russians to gain this momentum and capture village after village at this fast pace and moving on, capturing fortified positions of the Ukrainians and continuously really just improving significantly the offensive operations in the area, is that they have started to make use of their significant manpower advantage. According to Deep State Map, multiple companies of Russian soldiers are present near the front by Prodes and Vovche, where they are pushing onwards, capturing the positions and holding up positions in the village in the hundreds. This has allowed the Russians to significantly improve the ability to push onwards, because instead of sending a few troops, gaining a foothold, then slowly pushing through with the help of artillery, capturing building after building, they're now attacking on a wider front and capturing more at the same time and having a much quicker pace at pushing onwards. And at the same time, once they actually gain a foothold, they're actually able to hold onto it due to the increase in number of soldiers. This means two things. Another either or of my analysis, and that is either I was correct in saying that a mistake the Russians were doing is that they were not sending enough troops to the front, and that is due to the fact that a FPV drone, let's say we have a unit of Russian soldiers. This unit of Russian soldiers are 5 soldiers and they are moving in a straight line or curved line where they are trying to move along their front line. They have a distance between them as they are moving. If a Ukrainian FPV drone hits them into center, then maybe it'll kill one and then other 2 gets wounded and the final 2 are fine. Now, if we expand this idea, we create a line of 7 people on 3 separate lines, and then suddenly we have a lot more troops. This means that the Ukrainians will also send more FPV drones in that direction, concentrating their forces in one area. And then suddenly we have 3 separate FPV drones hitting. They hit these 3 areas. And suddenly there are 3 casualties that were killed. And then we have multiple wounded as well. But we also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 13 soldiers that are completely fine. No wounds, not killed, or anything. Suddenly, we have a lot more Russian soldiers that are able to fight despite the FPV drone strikes. This is a hypothetical, of course. There's a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different cases, a lot of different situations to be in. But as a general rule, if the Ukrainians have a limit of 1,000 FPV drones they can use every day, and the Russians attack with 1,000 soldiers, then there's 1 FPV drone for every soldier. Now, if the Ukrainians increase the capability to 2,000, the Russians are now able to send 10,000 soldiers, and suddenly there's 1 FPV drone for every 5 Russian soldier, but they're still only sending 1,000 to the front. Suddenly there's 2 FPV drones to every Russian soldier. So this is the current situation, how it has changed. The Russians now have hundreds of soldiers at the front instead of dozens, and the Ukrainians have not increased to this rate the amount of FPV drones and artillery that they're able to use at the front, and this allows the Russians to advance with more soldiers, but the same rate of casualties does not apply. They're actually taking less casualties based on the number of soldiers, but in total numbers, if they previously had taken 10 casualties out of 100, they're now taking 50 casualties out of 1,000. So it's a lower rate, but more casualties. But this is durable or sustainable for the Russians due to The continuous recruitment of soldiers as the time goes by. The Russian army continues to grow in size, as Sersky said in his interview with The Guardian, while they also have more equipment, they have more artillery, they have more of everything. Yet the Ukrainians are struggling to keep up with that, and that is what we see at the front line when the Russians continue advancing. At the same time, we also saw the recent push of the Russians against Konstantinivka. They managed to gain a foothold after not attacking it for a long time, and that could be due to the large concentration of forces, but we have also seen different types of strategies being used, so we have to make sure, based on how many different operations take place, how they're pulled out, how the Ukrainians match up in their defense, and so many other factors before we can come with any conclusion. And that is the other point. Either it is because the Ukrainians simply cannot keep up with the amount of FPV drones compared to the number of soldiers that the Russians have, or simply the Ukrainians are too thinly spread across the front. They're not able to concentrate enough forces here by Vovche or in the Pokrovsk section of the front line to compare with what the Russians are sending, and that is due to the large casualties of the Ukrainians and the large recruitment of Russian soldiers. And I say large casualties of the Ukrainians because with the current rate of mobilization of Ukrainian soldiers, if they were not taking a lot of casualties, they would be outnumbering the Russians. But instead, we see the Russians outnumbering the Ukrainians, and that is due to the casualties that the Ukrainians are taking because the Ukrainians have yet to demobilize. So that is not an reason for them to be lacking soldiers. Neither have they really done anything. The only reasonable explanation for Ukrainian lack of personnel is due to large casualties. Therefore, we can conclude that what we're currently seeing is exactly as I wrote on a Twitter post in December of last year. For Ukraine, the war has already been lost. It becomes worse and worse the more days go by. Without direct interference by Western nations, Ukraine can never win this war, and that has stayed true to this day. Ever since December, the situation has become worse and worse for the Ukrainians as every day goes by. We see the collapse, and really, it is really a collapse of the Turецk front by the fact that the Russians have managed to capture so much territory in such a short time in the final part of the front line that still has fortified positions of the 2014 area, and at the same time the Ukrainians created new defensive lines in the Avdiivka section, Pokrovsk section of the front line, yet they're unable to even slow down the Russian forces. All of this at the same time as the Russians are pushing in Krasnoarivka, Konstantinivka, Chasiv Yar, Siversk section of the front line, Kremenna section of the front line, Kupiansk section of the front line, and they've managed to capture Staromayorsk and Urashina in the south. They're pushing along the roads south of Konstantinivka along Volodar. The Russians are on the offensive everywhere, and it is speeding up, not slowing down, unlike the Ukrainian summer offensive, where it started slowing down at this point. We're now 2 months into the Russian offensive, and it has only just begun. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.